I wanted the houses to look believable even when destroyed, plus I couldn't find any online that matched the scene, so I decided to build them from scratch. Here's a cool trick if you want to create wood that splinters when simulated. Take a normal cube, give it a particle system and set the source to volume so the points are scattered evenly throughout. Then go to quick effects, cell fracture and set the source limit to your desired amount of pieces. In this case I had to go with a pretty low value because I was gonna copy this piece of wood a bunch of times. Hit OK, and once it's done fracturing, select everything and hit SZ to scale everything on the Z axis. Give all of the pieces rigid bodies and you've got yourself a semi-realistic piece of breakable wood. If you want the piece to stick together a little bit more, just use the connect option and set it to chain by distance. Make sure all of the constraints are breakable and simulate again. I took this piece of wood and placed it in a house pattern, trying to keep it simple while still making it feel detailed. Then I added some roof tiles that don't really look like roof tiles, fractured the walls using explode modifier, and then textured everything with PBR textures from Polyhaven. I did the same thing again, but for a larger house, and constrained all of the pieces together. Now we have some houses that look kinda real when they're destroyed, and to be honest you could spend way more time on this step if you wanted to, but this looked fine for my purposes. At this point I started blocking out the scene a little bit, placing the houses in a nice formation and adding some vegetation, a pool and some grass to hide my terrible ground texture. I selected some of the palm trees and animated them individually to fall down as the water hit them, and then I gave them some cloth simulation and pinned the tree trunk using a vertex group. This way the tree trunk would fall down in a snappy motion and make the leaves fly everywhere. This was quite easy to set up, but it turned out to be my favorite part of the scene. It just made the water feel a lot more powerful and dangerous. For the rest of the trees I decided to use the same method I used for the ferns in my plane crash video. So I joined them all together, made a low poly deform mesh, simulated that, and then applied the motion from that using a surface deform modifier. This barely slowed down my scene at all and looked pretty good in the final shots. In some places you could see some weird artifacts from the deform modifier, but considering how performant it was, that's absolutely fine by me. At this point it was time to work on making the water actually look like water. I did some tests using Blender's fluid simulation and used the particles option to spawn these animated foam particles. This was the result I got from that, which in my opinion looks pretty good, but there were a lot of problems with the particles spawning and dying in frame, so I tried using the particle lifetime as a factor for the density in the shading so that they would fade out before disappearing, but for some reason that didn't work. I also worried that the repeating pattern of the splashes would be too obvious in the final render. I usually add a lot of rotation randomness to the particles, but that's not supported when using fluid sims, so after some more tests I scrapped the idea of using a real fluid sim and instead animated this transparent object to move across the scene, and then use a normal particle system at the front in order to get some splashes of foam. I rendered these splash sprites from a separate blend file, and to get the water-like movement I used this add-on called Molecular. This allows the particles to clump together, sort of like how water drops would, and I set the particles to render as a metaball, which basically makes it so that the surface between two particles can stick together into one mesh. Once that was all baked, I set up an orthographic camera which eliminates all perspective, and then rendered out a PNG sequence. Then I imported those images back into Blender using the native add-on images as planes, and multiplied my output width with the number of frames, so 50 in this case. Then I lined up the camera using the snap option and rendered out a really big image of all of the frames lined up next to each other. Now I could use that image on a plane and shift it by 1080 pixels for each frame the particle has been alive, and for some reason the scrolling didn't really line up and gave this sliding effect, but I solved that quite easily by using a math node set to snap, and the value here should be 1 divided by the number of frames. I'm really not a node expert, but this was fairly simple after watching some similar tutorials on YouTube. Now the splashes fade out quite naturally, and the sheer number of particles hides the fact that they're all completely two-dimensional. I baked all of the simulations and then set up some different camera angles with a bit of camera shake, and after rendering for a while on pretty low settings, this was my result. You might notice a very obvious problem here, and that is the fact that we don't have any motion blur at all. This is because I decided to actually add the motion blur in post, and this was for two reasons mainly. First of all, it just saved on some render times, and secondly, I actually liked the look the optical flow motion blur gave to the whole scene. It just felt a little bit more chaotic, and it sort of blended everything together a little bit more. Then all I did was do some color grading and sound design, and this was the final result. Thank you so much for watching, and feel free to leave any suggestions of a future topic that you'd like me to cover. I want to thank you so much for the support. We recently passed 32,000 people on this channel, which is absolutely insane if you think about it. I've got plans for some pretty cool stuff coming up, so if you're interested in sticking around for that and you're not subscribed, feel free to consider doing so. Again, thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.